The German Shepherd walked past 3 surgeons, a trauma team, and a combat wounded SEAL without breaking stride, and stopped directly in front of a hospital nurse who claimed she'd never served a day in uniform. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply sat down at her feet, looked up at her face, and refused to move. The soldiers in that emergency room had worked with this dog through 2 combat deployments. They knew what his behavior meant. He only responded that way to one person in the world, and that person had been officially declared dead for 5 years. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind we tell on this channel. Kind that starts in a hospital corridor and ends in a courtroom. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The storm had been building since 9 o'clock, and by midnight it had turned violent. Rain hammered the windows of Harlow General Hospital in Tacoma, Washington, in sheets so thick the parking lot lights outside looked like smeared watercolors. Inside, the emergency department was already running at capacity 3 car accident victims from the high pileup on Route 16, a septic patient in Bay 4 who'd been declining for the past 2 hours, and a gunshot wound that had come in by ambulance 40 minutes ago and wasn't responding the way it should. Nurses moved fast and quiet. Doctors moved loud and irritated. The overhead fluorescents buzzed with that specific frequency that gave everyone who worked under them a headache by the 3rd hour of a shift. And nobody talked about it anymore because nobody had the energy. Nurse Lydia Marsh had been on since 7 in the evening. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with dark circles under her eyes that she'd stopped trying to conceal about 3 years into this job. Her brown hair was pulled back in a knot that had started neat and was now doing something else entirely. She was good at her work, the kind of good that other nurses noticed and doctors occasionally resented, methodical, fast, with a stillness to her hands that didn't belong to someone who'd spent a decade in emergency nursing. Belonged to someone who had learned to work through fear before fear had a name. She was checking vitals on the septic patient in Bay 4 when the double doors at the far end of the ER blew open. Not from the storm, from people. 4 of them came through first, moving with the deliberate economy of individuals who didn't have to announce themselves military short haircuts, civilian clothes that fit wrong across the shoulders, hands loose at their sides in the specific way that meant they knew exactly what to do with those hands if the situation required it. Behind them came 2 more, and between them, on a tactical lead, walked a German Shepherd 80, maybe 90 pounds, battle-scared across his left flank, one ear carrying a notch that hadn't been there when he was young. His eyes moved across the room with the systematic sweep of an animal that had been trained to assess threat before anything else. Behind all of them came a man with a clipboard and a bruised expression that suggested he'd been arguing with someone for the past hour and losing. "We called ahead," he said to the triage desk, as if that explained everything. Didn't, really. The triage nurse looked up from her screen, took in the group, and reached for the phone to call the charge nurse. Lydia didn't hear any of that. She was still in Bay 4, making a note in the chart, when her peripheral vision caught motion in the corridor, the dog moving past the glass partition, head swinging. She didn't look up. She finished the note. She set the chart back. She stepped out of the bay and almost walked directly into the animal. He stopped. She stopped. The dog looked at her, not the way animals look at strangers, with that wariness that takes 30 seconds to soften. He looked at her the way a trained dog looks at the one person in a room he has been waiting to find locked, certain, without any of the uncertainty that should have been present. His ears lifted. His tail moved once, slow, from left to right. Then he sat down at her feet and didn't take his eyes off her face. "Ranger." One of the soldiers said it sharply, a command wrapped in a name. The dog didn't move. Lydia looked from the dog up to the man who'd spoken late 30s, a jaw that looked like it had absorbed a fair amount of punishment, eyes that were doing the kind of rapid calculation that people learned in places where calculation determined who went home. His name tape on the civilian jacket was flipped under. She noted that. "You do this a lot?" she asked. "No," the man said. He was looking at her differently now, carefully. "He doesn't." "Injured?" "Not currently." "Then you need to take him to the designated area. We have a critical patient incoming, and I need this corridor clear." She said it's without heat, without aggression, just the flat directive of someone accustomed to having limited patience for things that interrupted patient care. She stepped around the dog. The dog stood up and stepped with her, turning to keep his body aligned with hers. The soldier she'd clock him, as the ranking one later. She could already tell by the way the others watched him. For reaction, took a breath. He crouched down to the dog's level and gave a hand signal, palm flat, a quiet command. Ranger sat again. But he kept watching Lydia as she moved to the next bay. She felt it on the back of her neck the whole time. The military team's wounded man's was a SEAL named Petty Officer Drake, 28 years old, with 2 fragments in his left shoulder and a third the imaging would eventually show sitting 4 millimeters from his clavicle. He'd been stabilized in the field, but he needed proper imaging and a surgical consult, and somebody in his chain of command had decided Harlow General was the facility with the right clearance for whatever case classification this was. Lydia wasn't the assigned nurse. She was across the hall working a different patient. She could still hear everything. His BP is dropping again. That was Nurse Paulina Reyes, young, 3 years out of school, competent in the way that still required visible effort. It shouldn't be dropping. He was stable an hour ago. That was Dr. Garrett Howell, the attending on duty, mid-50s, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been good at something for too long, without anyone telling him so. He had a way of speaking that landed just slightly above the person he was addressing, like he was addressing the wall behind their head. He's been declining since transport, one of the soldiers said from the doorway. I'm aware, Howell said without looking at him. The fragment near the clavicle. I know what the fragment is doing. Howell reached for the chart, frowned at something in it. Did someone already run a coagulation panel? It wasn't ordered, Paulina said. Why wasn't it ordered? Silent. From the corridor, Lydia could see Howell's expression, the frown deepening, not at the situation, but at the room, at the people in it. She could also see Drake's color. She could see the way his chest was moving. She finished what she was doing, snapped off her gloves, and walked to the doorway of Bay 2. His clotting is compromised, she said. Howell looked at her. Excuse me? The fragment near the clavicle is less of an issue than the fact that he's not clotting the way he should be. If he was in the field for any length of time before transport, and if they were using a particular hemostatic protocol, she stopped herself. You'll want to check for heparin interaction. He might have been given something in the field that's counteracting. The room was quiet for a second. Nurse Howell started. Marsh, Bay 4 is mine. I'm just saying what I'm seeing. What you're seeing from the hallway. Yes. He stared at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had been correct about most things for most of his career and found challenges to that track record personally offensive. Thank you, Nurse Marsh. Your input has been received. Please return to your assigned bay. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat. Then she went back to her own patient. Behind her, she heard one of the soldiers say something quiet to Howell. She didn't catch the words. She caught Howell's response. She's a floor nurse. She doesn't have access to their intake documentation. 30 minutes later, the coagulation panel came back. The heparin interaction was exactly what she had described. She heard the results relayed across the nursing station while she was completing her charting. She didn't say anything. She updated her own patient's notes and moved on. The soldier who'd been with the dog found her at the supply station. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, as if he were making a decision about whether to. Ranger was at his side, lead slack, watching her with that same unreadable focus. Captain Dominic Vasquez, he said. Special operations. She looked at him. Can I help you, Captain? You knew about the heparin. I noticed some things. Anyone with field triage experience would have. Do you have field triage experience? She turned back to the supply shelf. I have ER experience. It overlaps. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. He wasn't the kind of man who talked to fill space. She'd registered that already. When he did speak, it was measured, deliberate, like he'd chosen each word individually. Ranger has a very specific behavioral protocol. It took 3 years and 2 combat deployments to build it. He does not respond the way he responded to you, to anyone outside his handler unit. Dogs do unusual things, especially in stressful environments. Lydia Marsh, Vasquez said. Licensed RN. Employed at Harlow General for 4 years. Prior to that, Cascade Medical Center in Seattle. Prior to that, he paused. The record gets thin. She turned to look at him. His expression hadn't changed. You have no verifiable employment history before 2020. No military service listed, no overseas experience. Nothing that explains your medical knowledge or the way you just diagnosed a combat wound from a hallway. I'm a good nurse. You told our medic his patient had a heparin interaction before a panel was ordered, based on a visual from 20 feet away. It's not nursing. That's field medicine. He watched her. Who are you? The storm hit the window at the end of the corridor, and Lydia didn't flinch at the sound, but her jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just for a second. I'm the person who needs to get back to her patient, she said. Excuse me. She moved past him. Ranger turned to watch her go, not moving until she'd disappeared around the corner. She'd been careful for 5 years. That was the thing nobody understood. Careful wasn't paranoid. Careful was systematic. It was methodical. It was the daily discipline of making yourself small enough to disappear into ordinary life without creating gaps that someone could put their fingers into and pull. She had a name, a history, a license. She had a rented apartment on the east side of Tacoma with a deadbolt she'd installed herself and 3 exit routes she'd mapped on the first day she moved in. She had a routine so consistent that it had become genuine. She wasn't performing the life of Lydia Marsh anymore. She had become her, or she thought she had. She was pulling fresh gloves from the dispenser outside Bay 4 when she heard it, not loudly. Vasquez was on his phone at the far end of the corridor, and he'd lowered his voice, but sound carried differently in hospitals at midnight. The noise compression of the storm outside, the specific quiet of the building's interior, the way voices found the hard surfaces and traveled. She caught 3 words: Operation Cold Spire. Her hand went still on the glove dispenser. Her heart didn't race. It had never raced the way it was supposed to. Something she'd noticed about herself years ago and had stopped trying to analyze in moments of genuine danger. She went quiet. Everything went quiet. The world sharpened and slowed, and she became something more fundamental than afraid. She pulled the gloves on. She went into Bay 4. She checked her patient's vitals with hands that did not shake. Operation Cold Spire. She hadn't heard that name in 5 years. She hadn't spoken it in 5 years. It existed in the part of her memory that she'd walled off because the alternative was dismantling herself completely and starting over in a way that couldn't be done twice. She hadn't been a nurse before 2019. She had been Lieutenant Elise Harmon, combat medic, field extraction specialist, assigned to a Joint Special Operations task force whose missions didn't appear in public records and whose casualties didn't appear in public obituaries. She had been 29 years old, 3 years into a military career that had taken her to places she still couldn't name in her sleep without waking up cold, when Operation Cold Spire had gone catastrophically wrong. Extraction mission. 5 personnel. A location that wasn't supposed to be hostile. Timeline that collapsed in the first 4 minutes when they realized the intelligence had been burned not by the enemy, not by chance, but deliberately, from inside. 5 people on that extraction. Only 1 had come home. The military record said all 5 had died. Dr. Howell came to find her at 1:30 in the morning, and he didn't come to apologize. Coagulation thing, he said, stopping in the doorway of Bay 4. That was a reasonable observation. But I'd appreciate if you kept your observations to your own cases going forward. Understood, Lydia said. The military team is asking about you. I noticed. I don't know what that's about, and I don't need to know, but I want it handled. Whatever you said to them, whatever you did, I gave a clinical observation in the corridor. That's all. Then why is that dog following you? She looked past him. Ranger was in the hallway, lead attached to nothing, sitting 6 feet from the bay entrance. Someone had let go of him, or he'd managed the lead himself. He was looking at her. I don't know, she said. Howell looked at the dog. He looked at her. He was going to say something else. She could see him building to it, the particular posture of a man about to expand his authority over a situation he didn't fully understand. Then his pager went off. He looked at it, swore quietly, and left. Lydia stood alone in the bay for a moment. Her patient was stable, sedated, breathing with the slow rhythm of the medicated. She looked at Ranger. How, she said quietly, did you end up here? The dog's ears moved. Outside, the storm hit a pitch that made the windows tremble. The fluorescence flickered once, twice, then held. In the bay across the corridor, she could hear the SEAL team talking in lowered voices, and now she caught another fragment, sharper than the first, because Vasquez had stopped trying to be quiet. He was on a different call now. She could tell by the shift in his posture, visible through the glass. Confirmed, he said. She reacted to Cold Spire. No question. A pause. Yes. Same indicators. I want a verification team here within the hour. Lydia's hands were still. Her face was still. She closed the chart she was holding and set it on the bedside stand with the quiet precision of someone who had already decided what the next 30 minutes of her life needed to look like. She had three things working for her: the storm, the chaos of a fully active emergency department, and the fact that Vasquez didn't know she'd heard him. She had one thing working against her. The dog had already moved to block the bay entrance, sitting square in the middle of it, ears up, looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had trained him to have it. Ranger had been her dog, before Cold Spire, before Elise Harmon had ceased to exist, before she had become Lydia Marsh and buried everything she'd ever known how to be under 4 years of careful, ordinary, unremarkable life. He had been hers. And somewhere in the 5 years since, someone had brought him back into active service, and tonight of all nights, in a storm-battered emergency room in Tacoma, Washington, he had walked through those doors and found her. Corridor lights flickered again. When they steadied, Vasquez was standing in the doorway behind the dog, phone down, looking directly at her. "Lieutenant Harmon," he said. Not a question. She didn't answer him right away. That was the first thing Vasquez would remember later, not what she said. But the silence before it, the way she looked at him across the dog's back, with an expression that wasn't fear and wasn't guilt and wasn't the panicked blankness of someone caught in a lie. It was something harder to categorize. The look of a person who had been running a calculation for the last 4 years and had just received the answer she'd been dreading. "That name," Lydia said, "is not mine." The dog disagrees. The dog is an animal responding to a familiar scent in a high-stress environment. That's not identification. Vasquez stepped into the bay. Not aggressively, he moved the way he did everything, with a deliberateness that made the space feel smaller. He stopped 6 feet from her, which was close enough to make a point and far enough to not make it a confrontation. Yet, "We have a protocol for this situation," he said. "I need you to come with me." "To where?" "Somewhere quieter. I have patients. Paulina Reyes can cover your patients." That he knew the other nurse's name, that he'd already mapped the department, already identified the staffing, already built the infrastructure of this conversation before he'd walked into the bay, told her everything about how long this had been in motions. It wasn't a coincidence. Ranger showing up tonight wasn't random. Maybe it had never been random. "I'm not leaving my unit," she said. "Lieutenant, don't call me that." Her voice was flat. "I'm Nurse Marsh. I work this department. I don't know what you've been told or what you think you've found, but you are disrupting a functioning emergency room during a storm surge, and whatever you need can wait until my shift ends." She reached past him for a chart. He let her. He watched her flip it open and make a notation with the pen she kept in her breast pocket, and his expression was unreadable, but his jaw was doing something tight. "Drake is going to need surgical consult," she said, without looking up. "Push Howell on that. He's going to wait until morning, and that's going to be a problem." "How do you know that?" "Because that's what he does. I've worked with him for 2 years. She closed the chart. "I'm going to check on the patient in Bay 6. You can follow me or you can go stand somewhere else." She walked out. Ranger stood and followed her. Vasquez watched them go, and for a moment he just stood in the empty bay with the storm outside and the fluorescents buzzing, and then he got back on his phone. The next hour was the strangest of Lydia's working life, which was saying something because her working life had included a 12-hour firefight in a location that no longer existed on any map she could access. She moved through her shift. She checked vitals. She updated charts. She pushed the night resident on the septic patient's declining numbers and got the antibiotic adjustment she'd been angling for since 11. She was precise and fast, and she didn't stop moving, because the momentum of the work was the only thing keeping the other thing, the Cold Spire thing, the Ranger thing, Lieutenant Harmon thing, from expanding into every available space in her chest. Vasquez didn't leave. He positioned himself at the nursing station with the quiet authority of a man who didn't require an invitation to occupy a space, and he watched her. Not constantly, he was too experienced for that, too aware of how obvious something looked, but she felt his attention the way she'd learned to feel things she couldn't always see. Peripheral. Consistent patient. 2 of his men were at the ER entrance. A third had materialized near the back corridor, and he was doing a worse job of appearing casual than Vasquez. He kept looking at his phone, and then at her, and then at his phone. She noted all of it and kept moving. At 2:15, Howell found her again. "The military team wants your personnel file," he said. "They can submit a formal request through HR." They said it's a national security matter. Then they can get a subpoena. She stripped off a pair of gloves and dropped them in the bin. Drake in surgery yet? Howell blinked. What? Patient. Bay 2. Is he in surgery? He's the surgical consult hasn't. His pressure has been dropping for 90 minutes, and you have a fragment sitting 4 millimeters from a major vessel. If you wait until morning, you're going to be writing an incident report. She met his eyes. I know you know this. I don't know why you're waiting. Howell's face did something complicated. He was a man who did not enjoy being told what he already knew by someone he'd spent the last 3 hours dismissing. The discomfort of it moved across his features in a brief, ugly sequence irritation, resistance, a specific pride of a man who'd confused seniority with infallibility, and then something else, something quieter, won out. I'll make the call, he said. Thank you, he left. She heard him on the phone 2 minutes later, and 20 minutes after that, Drake was being prepped for surgery, and the SEAL team's collective tension dropped by a measurable degree. Not entirely, they were still watching her. Vask was still watching her, but the specific anxiety of watching their man decline had eased, and she felt it in the room like a pressure change. Vasquez came to find her at the supply station again. This time he didn't lead with her name. He was going to wait, he said. Yes, you knew that. I told you I knew that. He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, through the narrow window at the end of the corridor, lightning moved across the water in the distance. A brief cold illumination, there and gone. People I contacted an hour ago, he said, carefully, are going to arrive in approximately 40 minutes. They're not here to arrest you. I want you to understand that. What are they here for? To verify. And then to talk. About Cold Spire. He didn't answer immediately, and in the pause, she heard the weight of it, the specific density of information being managed, parceled, offered in pieces. Among other things, he said. Who are they? Naval Criminal Investigative. One of them has been working the Iron Spire case, the broader operation, for 2 years. Iron Spire. She'd known it as Cold Spire when she'd lived inside it. The naming variants told her something about how the investigation had evolved in the years since, how it had been categorized and recategorized by people working from the outside, people who hadn't been there. 2 years, she said. Yes, and in 2 years they didn't find me. No. Then why tonight? He glanced at Ranger, who was sitting 3 feet away with the patience of an animal that had learned patience as a survival skill. He has a biological tracker implant. Standard protocol for working dogs in classified units. 18 months ago, when he was reassigned to active service, the tracking system was updated. Tonight was the first time the system flagged a geographic proximity match to a specific set of coordinates. She understood it immediately. My apartment. Your route from your apartment to this hospital. You walked the same path every shift. Of course she did. Routine had been protective. She'd made it protective on purpose. But routine was also a pattern, and a pattern was a data set, and she'd spent 5 years avoiding the digital traces, and had never thought once about the biological ones, had never imagined that the dog she'd trained and lost and grieved would walk back into her life at the end of a leash, held by someone she'd never met. He was mine, she said. It wasn't a question. She said it the way you say something you've been not saying for years, flat and careful, like setting down something heavy. Vasquez looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. His original handler records were sealed when the operation was classified. Pulled them when I started running the proximity match. His first trainer is listed as he stopped. Don't say the name. Closed his mouth. She looked at Ranger. The dog looked back at her. In her chest, something that had been locked and quiet for 5 years, did something complicated that she didn't have language for and didn't want. 40 minutes, she said, roughly. Then I have 40 minutes to finish my shift work. She picked up the supply kit. Don't follow me into any more patient bays. She used the 40 minutes well. Not to run, she'd thought about it. Assessed it in the first 90 seconds of having the option, and dismissed it with the same efficiency she'd dismissed it every time in the last 5 years. Running required a destination, and she'd run out of destinations. Whatever was coming tonight was coming whether she was in this hospital or 3 states away, and at least here she was on ground she knew. She used the time to think. Cold Spire had been a joint task force extraction, her team pulling a compromised asset out of a location she still couldn't name without the old training kicking in and making her speak in euphemism. 5 personnel plus the asset, a timeline of 11 minutes, a landing zone that was supposed to be secured. The intelligence had been wrong. not outdated, not misread wrong in the specific way that meant someone with access to the operation's details had fed false position data upstream. And by the time her team realized it, the window for extraction had closed, and the hostile presence at the LZ was too heavy for their loadout. 3 of her team had died in the first 4 minutes. The 4th had been captured. She had never found out what happened to him afterward. She had tried not to think about it, because thinking about it in the years since was the kind of thing that made ordinary life impossible. She had gotten out alone, with injuries she'd treated herself, in a country she couldn't acknowledge being in, and when she'd finally reached a contact point 2 weeks later, she'd been told by a man in a clean uniform in a clean office that Operation Cold Spire had been classified at a level that made her own participation in it a liability, and that the official record would list all 5 personnel as killed in action, and that the best thing she could do for herself and for the mission and for her country was to accept the documentation being prepared for her and disappear. She'd been 29 years old and the only person still alive who knew exactly what had gone wrong and why. She'd taken the documentation. She'd become Lydia Marsh, and she'd spent 5 years working emergency nursing in Tacoma, Washington, being quiet and capable and unremarkable, saving the occasional life and losing the occasional patient, and she'd thought she had genuinely thought that the version of herself she'd buried had stayed buried. At 2:52 in the morning, she was updating a chart at the nursing station when Paulina appeared at her elbow. "There's a situation at the front desk," Paulina said. She looked uncomfortable. "Dr. Howell wants you." "What kind of situation?" "There are people, suits, and a woman who says she's federal." Lydia set the chart down. The woman at the front desk was Special Agent Dana Rourke, NCIS, late 40s, with the contained energy of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had developed opinions about how it should be done. She was compact and wore no-nonsense glasses, and she had the specific brand of authority that came not from volume, but from the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly why they were in a room. Beside her stood a younger agent whose name Lydia didn't catch, and a man in naval uniform whose rank insignia she clocked automatically the way she clocked everything. Rear Admiral Terrence Doyle. She didn't know the name, but the rank landed in her chest like a stone in water. Howell was at the desk, looking deeply unhappy. "Nurse Marsh," he said. "These individuals are." "I know why they're here," Lydia said. Rourke looked at her. Something moved briefly in her expression, not surprise, more like recognition of something she'd expected. "Ms. Marsh," she said. "Agent Rourke." She'd caught the badge. "Is there somewhere we can talk that isn't the middle of my emergency room?" "There's a conference room," Howell started. "The one on the 2nd floor is empty at this hour," Lydia said. She looked at Howell. "Paulina can cover the floor for 20 minutes. Drake's in surgery. The septic patient in 4 is stable. Bay 6 is observation only." She looked back at Rourke. 20 minutes. "That should be sufficient," Rourke said. The conference room was beige and smelled of old coffee and the particular institutional staleness of a room used mainly for bad news. The table had 7 chairs and they used 4 of them. Vasquez came too, without being invited, and nobody asked him to leave. Ranger lay down under the table near Lydia's feet. Rourke opened a folder. She turned it so Lydia could see the top sheet, which was a photograph. Blurred, taken from a distance, probably from a satellite or a high-altitude assasset, but the terrain was recognizable. She'd spent 2 weeks in that terrain. She would have recognized it from a much worse photograph. "I've been working the Iron Spire case for 2 years, Rourke said. Cold Spire was a sub-operation within Iron Spire, the extraction that was supposed to remove 3 civilian intelligence assets from a country that doesn't appear in the file. When Cold Spire failed, the entire Iron Spire apparatus was shut down, officially. And unofficially, Iron Spire kept running for 18 months after Cold Spire." Rourke turned another page. "Casualty reports from Cold Spire, your unit, were falsified. Cause of death documentation was fabricated. The intelligence failure that led to the ambush was attributed to enemy surveillance, when we now have evidence it was an internal leak." Lydia looked at the photograph. She looked at the page. She kept her expression where it was. "Who?" "We have 2 suspects at the senior level. One is currently in command of a joint operations center in Virginia. The other retired 14 months ago and is now in private security consulting." Rourke paused. "His name is Victor Nolan." Something cold moved through Lydia's chest. "I know that name. He was the operations director for Cold Spire. He signed off on the intelligence package that gave your team the false LZ coordinates. The room was quiet. Outside, rain moved against the window. Vasquez was very still. He knew, Lydia said. We believe he authorized it. He sent my team into a confirmed hostile position with false intelligence. Yes. And then he classified the operation and buried the casualty reports. Yes. She looked at Rourke. Why? Because your team found something they weren't supposed to find during the asset extraction. One of the individuals you were pulling out had documentation physical records implicating Nolan and the second suspect in a pattern of unauthorized operations stretching back 7 years. Operations that generated significant financial. He killed my team to protect his bank account, Lydia said. The flatness of her voice filled the room. Rourke held her gaze. That's the short version, yes. The younger agent shifted in his seat. Doyle, the admiral, had been quiet since sitting down. He spoke now, and his voice was the carefully managed voice of a man who had delivered bad news many times and had stopped pretending there was a good way to do it. Lieutenant Harmon, I want to say on behalf of, I'm not a lieutenant anymore, Lydia said. Regardless. What do you need from me? She looked between them. You didn't come here at 3 a.m. in a storm to deliver a case summary. What do you need? Rourke and Doyle exchanged a look. Rourke closed the folder. Victor Nolan became aware, 6 weeks ago, that the Iron Spire investigation had surfaced new evidence. He's been moving to neutralize witnesses and evidence sources. 2 people connected to the original case have had she stopped. There have been 2 incidents. Say it. They're both dead. One ruled accidental. One ruled suicide. We don't believe either ruling. Lydia's jaw was tight. And you think he knows you found me? We think he knew before we did, Vasquez said. It was the first thing he'd said since sitting down, and the flatness of it landed differently than Rourke's careful language. The tracker system that flagged your proximity data, it was accessed from outside the military network 3 days ago. Someone ran the same geographic search we did. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. 3 days ago, Lydia said. Yes, he's been watching me for 3 days. We don't know what he knows or what he's planning. Access to the tracking system means he knows I'm alive. She said it quietly. He didn't know. All this time, he thought the documentation held. Thought I was gone. Yes, and now he doesn't. Rourke opened her mouth to continue, and that was when Lydia's pager went off. She looked at it. Bay 4, her septic patient. I need to go, she said. Lieutenant, I need to go. She stood up. My patient is crashing. She was out the door before Rourke finished the sentence, and Ranger was behind her, his nails clicking on the linoleum in the corridor, and she pushed through the stairwell door and went down fast, not running. The controlled, rapid movement of someone who'd been taught that running created noise and noise created problems. Bay 4 was in fact declining. She hadn't doubted the pager. She never doubted patient signals. It was a different kind of reflex than the operational ones, but equally ingrained, and for the next 20 minutes, she worked the code with Paulina and the night resident, adjusting pressors and talking through the case in the clipped shorthand of emergency medicine. And she held the patient in her head and the other thing alongside it simultaneously, the way she'd learned to hold 2 realities at once a long time ago in a training program she wasn't supposed to remember. Patient stabilized. Not perfectly. Not cleanly. There would be an ICU transfer. At first light in a conversation with a family that nobody was going to enjoy, but she stabilized. And Lydia stepped back from the bedside, and the resident said something about her being good in a crisis, an offhand compliment, and she didn't answer because she was watching the doorway. Vasquez was there. His expression had changed. What? She said. Nolan. He said it low. He's not waiting. What does that mean? It means we got a call from the Virginia field office 20 minutes ago. He left his house 3 days ago. He's been off-grid since. Vasquez stepped closer. 6 minutes ago, the hospital's external camera network registered 3 vehicles on Meridian Street, parked, engines off, and nobody's getting out. Lydia looked past him into the corridor. The hospital was quieter at this hour, reduced staff, reduced noise, the middle of the night hush that made every sound carry further than it should. He tracked me here, she said. Or he tracked where Rourke was going. She's not exactly invisible. How many people does he have? We don't know. Best guess, enough. He met her eyes. Rourke is calling for backup, but the storm has response times running long. We have 4 personnel in the building. You have. He stopped, seeming to recalibrate what he was about to say. I have patience, she finished. I have 42 patients in this building, and half of them can't move on their own. She looked at the corridor, at the fluorescent lights, at the nursing station, and the bays, and the supply rooms, and the exit she'd mapped without meaning to, on her first week at this hospital, the way she mapped every space she occupied. How long before backup arrives? 40 minutes. Maybe less. Maybe more. Yes. She pulled off her gloves. She dropped them in the bin. Her hands were steady. They were always steady in the bad moments she'd stopped, being surprised by that years ago. Then we need to be smart about the next 40 minutes, she said. We, Vasquez said. You have 4 people in a compromised building and a man outside who already killed my entire team once. She looked at him. Yes, Ranger had moved to the entrance of Bay 4 and was standing with his weight forward, ears up, locked on something in the direction of the east corridor, the direction of the loading dock, the direction of the building's secondary entrance, the direction of the one access point that her staff propped open with a rubber wedge on cold nights because the keycard reader had been broken for 3 weeks and facilities kept postponing the repair. She knew about the wedge. She'd noticed it on her second day. The dog was telling her something. She looked at him, and she understood it. And the particular coldness that settled into her chest then was not fear. It had never been fear. Not exactly. Not even in the worst moments. It was the recognition of a situation that had already begun moving and could not be stopped, only navigated. The east corridor light flickered once, then went out. East corridor stayed dark. Not the flickering dark of a tripped breaker or a storm surge, pulling power from a non-essential circuit, the specific surgical dark of a light that had been cut from outside, selectively, which meant whoever was in the parking lot on Meridian Street had either accessed the building's external junction box or had someone already inside who knew where it was. Lydia moved before Vasquez finished processing it. Get Rourke, she said. Get your people to the east corridor now. The loading dock door has been propped open for 3 weeks. Keycard reader is broken. There's a rubber wedge at the base. If they're not already through it, they will be in the next 2 minutes. How do you know about because I work here? Go. He went. She went the other direction. The nursing station was 20 feet from Bay 4, and Paulina was there doing charting with the particular hunched focus of someone trying to stay awake on the back half of a night shift. Lydia reached the desk and put her hand flat on the surface. Paulina, I need you to listen to me carefully. Paulina looked up. Something in Lydia's face made her sit straighter. What's wrong? I need you to activate the internal lockdown protocol. Don't call it a drill. Tell security there's a potential threat at the east entrance and the loading dock. Then I need you to start moving ambulatory patients to the interior rooms, bays 1 through 3, away from the east-facing corridor. Non-ambulatory stay where they are. You close and lock their bay doors. Lydia, do you trust me? A beat. Yes. Then move. Now. Don't use the overhead PA. Use the staff channel on the handsets. Quiet as you can. Paulina was already reaching for the handset. Lydia turned. Ranger was at the mouth of the east corridor, and he wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing with his body angled forward, and his ears pinned, tail low, specific posture of a trained working dog that has identified a threat and is waiting for instruction. She hadn't given him instruction in 5 years. Her hand moved, without entirely consulting her brain, 2 fingers, forward, the hand signal for advance and alert, a gesture so old it lived in muscle memory below conscious thought. He moved into the corridor. She followed him. The east corridor was a long straight run from the nursing station to the loading dock about 60 feet, with supply rooms 60 feet, seats on the left and a staff bathroom and a utility closet on the right. Overhead fluorescents were out for the full length of it, but the emergency strip lighting at floor level was still active, throwing a low red-orange glow that illuminated the bottom 18 inches of everything and turned the rest to shadow. Lydia moved along the left wall, staying low. She was not armed. She was wearing scrub pants and a hospital-issue zip-up over her nursing uniform, and she had a pen in her breast pocket and a small flashlight clipped to her badge, lanyard, and absolutely nothing else that could be characterized as a weapon, which meant she was thinking about the supply rooms and the utility closet the way she'd been trained to think about any environment, as a resource set, not as a backdrop. Supply room on the left had a lock that required a keycard. She pressed herself flat against the wall, swiped it, eased the door open. The room was dark inside. She stepped in, pulled the door almost closed, and used the flashlight in a quick 3-second sweep. Shelving units. IV supplies, dressing kits, procedure trays, a rack of blood pressure cuffs, a biohazard disposal container. And on the bottom shelf, where they'd been since a surplus restocking 6 months ago, 2 emergency tourniquet kits, still in their packaging, and a pair of trauma shears. She pocketed the shears and both tourniquets, which wasn't a plan so much as the beginning of one. Far end of the corridor, something moved. Not Ranger. Ranger was ahead of her, and she could track him by his movement pattern, the specific rhythmic quality of how he displaced air when he advanced. This was something else. A shape in the emergency lighting, low to the floor, moving wrong. Someone who'd come through the loading dock door and was trying to stay below the sightlines. 2 shapes, then a third. Ranger stopped. She stopped. The 3 shapes moved up the corridor with the trained economy of people who'd done this before, not rushing, not hesitating, systematic. They were wearing dark clothing, and she couldn't see weapons clearly in the low light, but the way their hands were positioned told her everything she needed to know about what they were holding. She had about 4 seconds before the lead operative's eyes adjusted enough to see her. She stepped backward into the supply room and pulled the door closed and locked it, and put her back against the shelving unit and breathed through her nose, slow, even, the breath pattern she'd learned in a training course she'd officially never attended. And she took out her phone. She texted Vasquez one word, East, 3 armed. Then she waited. Footsteps reached her door. Stopped. There was a pause she counted in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then they moved on. They'd registered the locked door and decided a locked room wasn't priority. She filed that away. It told her they weren't looking to clear the building methodically. They were looking for something specific. Or someone. Vasquez got the text at the same moment. His point man radioed from the stairwell. 3 confirmed in the east corridor. 1 more at the external junction box. He's still outside. Possibly a 5th unknown position. Vasquez keyed his radio. Non-lethal engagement if possible. We have patients in this building. Copy. Where's Rourke? Conference room. 2nd floor. Coordinating with the Virginia field office. She's got Doyle with her. What Vasquez needed was more personnel, and he had 4 people in a building he didn't know, as well as the woman currently locked in a supply closet. He made a decision. Rourke needs to come down here. Tell her I need her on the ground floor. He moved toward the east corridor from the south entrance, which put him coming in from the opposite end, the loading dock end, which meant he was going to be moving toward his own people with 3 armed unknowns between them, which was not an ideal tactical geometry, but the geometry had been set by whoever had cut the power to the corridor lights, and he was working with it rather than against it. Ranger appeared at the far end of the corridor, and then Ranger wasn't there. That was the thing about working dogs, that people who'd never worked with them didn't understand they didn't behave like equipment. They made assessments, and then they acted on those assessments with a speed and decisiveness that human operators were trained to recognize and follow, not override. Ranger had gone into the dark corridor and then disappeared, which meant he'd located something and chose a position. And Vasquez trusted that in the way he'd learned to trust things he'd trained for years to trust. He advanced along the wall. The first contact happened fast and loud, shouting from the direction of the nursing station. A crash that was heavy enough to be furniture, and then what Vasquez identified as a suppressed gunshot, the flat percussive sound of it bouncing hard off the corridor walls. He moved faster. One of his men came through from the south. At the same moment, the east corridor erupted in movement shapes colliding, something falling. A dog's sharp warning bark cutting through the noise like a signal through static. It was over in 40 seconds. Not cleanly. Nothing was clean. His operator took a hit to the left forearm that wasn't lethal but was ugly and would require a surgeon's attention within the hour. One of the 3 intruders was down in the corridor. Ranger had located him and held him. A textbook apparition that the dog executed with the efficiency of something that didn't hesitate and didn't second guess. The 2nd intruder was restrained by the 2nd SEAL, wrists zip-tied, back against the wall, saying nothing. The 3rd had retreated toward the loading dock, and Vasquez let him go because pursuing him outside the building with unknown additional forces in the parking lot was the wrong decision, and he knew it. Keyed his radio. 2 secured, 1 aggressed east. I have an operator down. Non-fatal. I need the building perimeter monitored. Copy. We've got movement on the Meridian side. 2 vehicles pulled out 30 seconds ago. Direction? North. They were repositioning. Not retreating repositioning. The supply room door opened and Lydia stepped out, with trauma shears in her right hand, and the calm expression of someone who'd spent the last 5 minutes preparing to do something she hadn't decided yet. She looked at the man. Ranger was holding on the ground, face down, not moving except for the controlled breathing of someone who'd been trained not to struggle when a dog had weight on you. She looked at the second man against the wall. She looked at the SEAL operator, sitting on the floor, with his left arm across his chest, bleeding through his sleeve. She went to the operator first. "Let me see it," she said. "I'm fine." "I know." "Let me see it anyway." He lifted his arm. The wound was on the lateral aspect of the forearm, through and through. She assessed in the first 5 seconds. Clean entry and exit. Missed the major vessels. Significant muscle trauma, but nothing that was going to kill him in the next hour. She opened one of the tourniquet kits and applied it 2 inches above the wound, not tight enough to fully occlude, but snug enough to reduce the bleed. And the operator looked at her hands while she worked with an expression she'd seen before on people who'd expected competent help and gotten something more than that. "You've done this before," he said. "Hold this pressure point," she told him. "Here, don't let go." She stood and looked at Vasquez. "Your man needs a surgeon. Drake's already in the OR. You're going to have to wait for him. Howell can do the consult. Right now, I'm more concerned with the third operative and whatever's waiting for us outside." "So am I." She handed him the second tourniquet kit because he might need it before this was over. "The man Ranger is holding, is he talking?" "Not yet." She looked at the man on the floor. He was maybe 35, short hair, the compact build of someone who'd spent years doing physical work. She crouched down to his level. "I'm a nurse," she said, which was true, and also, under the circumstances, the strangest sentence she'd said in years. "You're not injured. You're going to be transferred to federal custody within the hour. Before that happens, I'm going to ask you one question, and it would benefit you significantly to answer it." The man said nothing. His breathing was even. "How many people did Nolan bring?" she said. "Nothing. He already burned one team in a place that no longer exists on a map," she said. "He put my unit into a confirmed hostile position with false intelligence and let them die to protect himself. Whatever he's paying you is not enough for what happens to the people he decides are liabilities." The man's jaw moved. For a second she thought he was going to speak, and then he didn't, and she stood up. "Get him secured in a room with a lock," she told Vasquez. "Don't use a patient bay. The storage room, next to the utility closet, has a keyed deadbolt." She handed him the key card. The next phase of the crisis arrived in the form of Victor Nolan himself, which was not what she'd expected. She'd imagined Nolan as someone who sent people, who had always sent people, who had built his entire career on the institutional distance between the decisions he made and the consequences of those decisions. He'd sent her team into Cold Spire with false coordinates from the comfort of an operations center 3 continents away. He'd signed the casualty reports that buried them from behind a desk. A man like that didn't show up in person, except he had. Rourke came down the stairs at a near run and found Lydia and Vasquez in the corridor, and her expression was the particular tight blankness of someone delivering information they were still processing themselves. "He's here," she said. "Nolan, he's in the building." "How?" Vasquez said. "The disruption in the East Corridor, we think it was a diversion. While we were dealing with the 3 operatives, he came through the main entrance. He had hospital ID." She stopped. "Fabricated, obviously, but good enough to get past the desk. Where is he now?" "He went to the 2nd floor. That's where Doyle is." Her voice was very controlled. "Doyle's comms went down 4 minutes ago." Vasquez was already moving. Lydia moved with him. "You should stay on this floor," Rourke said behind her. "Doyle's the senior investigating officer on the Iron Spire case," Lydia said without turning around. "If Nolan gets to him, the investigation, I know what it means. Then you know I'm not staying on this floor." She took the stairs. The 2nd floor of Harlow General was the surgical and recovery wing, quieter than the ER at this hour. Staff density, patients behind closed doors in the specific hush of post-operative recovery. Conference room they'd used an hour ago was at the far end of the corridor. The door was closed. Vasquez held up a fist. She stopped. He listened. She listened. Inside the conference room, a voice she didn't recognize was speaking in a tone that was neither shouting nor calm, the controlled cadence of a man accustomed to delivering ultimatums and watching people respond to them. Then Admiral Doyle's voice, brief, resistant. Vasquez put 3 fingers up, counted down silently. On one, he opened the door. Victor Nolan was not what she'd pictured from the name in Roark's file, which was its own lesson. She knew better than to build a picture from a name. But the mind did it anyway. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the maintained physicality of someone who'd kept up the conditioning long after the operational years were behind him. He wore a dark jacket and no tie, and he looked like the kind of man who gave presentations to Senate subcommittees and was good at it. He did not look like a man who'd ordered the deaths of 4 people she'd known by name and by the sound of their voices in the dark. He looked entirely unsurprised to see her. That was the first thing she noticed. He looked at her across the conference room table, where Doyle was seated unhurt. She assessed that first. Doyle was unhurt, and his expression did something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief. Something between them that she didn't have a name for. Like a man who'd been calculating for a long time and had just confirmed a variable. "Lieutenant Harmon," he said. "You keep sending people to say that name," she said. "It doesn't change my answer." "What answer is that?" "That I'm not going back to being dead." There was a second man behind Doyle's chair, late 40s, the same contained, professional build as the operatives in the corridor. Vasquez had already identified him and was tracking him. Ranger had entered the room behind Lydia and positioned himself between her and Nolan with the clarity of an animal that had made a threat assessment and acted on it. Nolan looked at the dog. Something moved briefly in his face. "You trained him," he said. "He made his own decisions tonight. He always did." He was looking at Ranger with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, and she filed it away. "I didn't come here to threaten you," Nolan said. "You came here with armed operatives who cut my building's power and came through my loading dock in the middle of the night. That tends to read as threatening. Those were precautionary measures. 4 of my colleagues are dead, and you're describing precautionary measures." Nolan's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in the composure. Cold Spire was a decision made under extraordinary circumstances with incomplete. "Don't." Her voice was flat and cold and very quiet. "Don't build the sentence. I was there. I watched them die. I treated 3 of them, and I couldn't." She stopped herself. The room was very still. "You gave us false coordinates. You knew what was at those coordinates. You made a decision about which problem was easier to solve. The operation was compromised. The asset. My team was not the problem you were solving," she said. "We were the evidence. Fallon, Okafor, Maddox. They were the evidence. I was the evidence. You needed us gone before we could report what we'd found during the extraction." She looked at him steadily. "Found the secondary documentation. The asset gave it to Okafor during the first leg of the extraction. You knew because you had a source inside the unit." Nolan said nothing. "The documentation that implicated you and at least 1 other senior officer in running unauthorized operations for personal financial benefit. Operations that required the deaths of other people to maintain. Cold Spire was just the most recent layer of that." She watched his face. "NCIS has been building this case for 2 years. I'm going to guess the documentation we found is only a fraction of what they have now." "Agent Rourke's case is solid," Rourke said, from the doorway. "Come up the stairs behind them. Very solid. Solid enough that the Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office has been briefed and is prepared to move." She held up her phone. "I've been on with them for the last 6 minutes." She stepped into the room. "Victor Nolan, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of classified records, and 4 counts of murder in the first degree." The man behind Doyle's chair moved. Vasquez was faster. What happened in the next 8 seconds was not graceful. It was the brutally functional sequence of trained people doing what they'd been trained to do in close quarters. And when it resolved, the second operative was on the floor with his arm, at an angle it wasn't supposed to be at, making a sound of real pain that cut through the silence of the conference room, and Vasquez was standing over him, breathing hard, and Nolan had not moved. He was looking at Lydia. "You were dead," he said. And the way he said it was not triumphant, not threatening. It was the voice of a man encountering something he had spent 5 years. Believing was settled. Discovering it wasn't. There was something almost bewildered in it. "You were dead." The documentation said, "I know what it said." She held his gaze. "You should have checked your work." Rourke moved behind him with handcuffs, and Nolan let her do it, which she noted, not because it indicated cooperation, but because a man like Nolan would be calculating forward, past this moment, to the lawyers and the proceedings and the mechanisms he might still reach for. He wasn't done, not in his own mind. She could deal with that when the time came. Doyle stood up from his chair. He was pale and rigid, and when he spoke, his voice was carrying something that was trying hard to be authority and was mostly holding together. Is anyone hurt? Operative in the East Corridor took a hit to the forearm, Vasquez said. My man on the ground floor needs surgery, non-critical. He looked at Nolan's man on the floor. His shoulder is dislocated. He needs a physician. I'll handle it, Lydia said. She looked at the man, who was in real pain and showing it, and she crouched down to his level, and there was a particular strangeness to the moment. Assessing someone who'd been deployed to find her, treating his injury with the same clinical consideration she gave every patient, but she'd learned a long time ago that the strangeness of a situation didn't change what the situation required. You're going to be okay, she told him. The shoulder is dislocated, not broken. I'm going to need you to breathe through the next 30 seconds. Can you do that? He looked at her. He nodded. She did the reduction with practiced efficiency, a technique she'd used a dozen times in emergency settings. Quick and controlled and not comfortable for patient, but effective, and when it was done, he sagged against the wall and exhaled hard, cured his wrists with the zip ties. Vasquez handed her and stood up. The room was quiet. Nolan was cuffed. His operative was secured. Doyle was on his phone, calling up through the chain in the way senior officers did when situations needed to be recorded as managed rather than managed. Roark was already building the custody documentation. Ranger came to Lydia's side and sat down, pressing his shoulder against her leg. Put her hand on his head without thinking. Texture of his fur was exactly as she remembered, the same density, the same coarseness at the scruff, and the memory that arrived with it was not one she'd prepared for, the specific memory of the last morning before Cold Spire, checking his harness in the cold before a briefing, and his warm weight leaning against her knee exactly the way he was leaning now. Her throat closed briefly. She let it, then she cleared it and moved on. Because Vasquez's wounded operator was still on the ground floor, and Drake was in surgery, and the septic patient in Bay 4 was being transferred to the ICU at first light, and there were still 2 vehicles that had pulled north on Meridian Street, whose occupants were unaccounted for. Roark, she turned. The vehicles that repositioned. 2 on Meridian. We have an APB. That's not, she stopped. Nolan came with more people than were deployed inside the building. He wouldn't have come here without a contingency. Roark looked at her, then looked at Nolan. Nolan's expression had changed, again the calculating composure, the forward-facing attention of a man working through what he still had available. She'd seen it before in high-pressure situations, the particular focus of someone who'd decided the current position was temporary. What's the contingency, Lydia said. Not to Roark. To him. Nolan said nothing. You don't have a way out that doesn't go through this building, she said. Your people are in custody or gone. The federal field office has been briefed. You already know this is over. You're experienced enough to know it. She kept her voice level. The only question is whether anyone else in this building gets hurt before it concludes. Nolan looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the dog. He looked at his own wrists. Something moved through his face that she couldn't name. Some internal calculation reaching its terminal point. The vehicles have an extraction package, he said. Not for me. For what? He was quiet for 3 full seconds. In 2019, he said, before Cold Spire, the asset you were extracting provided a secondary data package to your unit. You were told that package was destroyed when the operation failed. It wasn't. He looked at her with the expression of a man offering a trade he hadn't decided he wanted to make. Preserved it physically. It's been held as an insurance mechanism. If I'm taken into custody, the contingency protocol activates. The vehicles have instructions to recover the package and destroy it. Air in the room changed. That package, Lydia said slowly, contains everything. Contains the complete secondary documentation from the 2019 extraction, every unauthorized operation, every financial record, every instruction chain going back 9 years. Names, amounts, dates. Everyone involved. He paused. Including 2 individuals who are not currently under investigation because NCIS doesn't know they exist. Roark took a breath that was audible. Where, Lydia said. Where is it? I want a conversation with the U.S. attorney before Victor. She said his first name. Flat and without any softness in it. 4 people are dead. 3 of them had families. Fallon had a daughter who was 8 months old when Cold Spire happened. She's 5 years old now, and her mother was told. Her father died in a training accident. Her voice did not shake. It was very steady, in the way that the worst anger is sometimes very steady. You don't get to negotiate with that. Where is the package? Something gave in him. Not completely. Not in the way it does in films, the clean collapse of a villain into confession. It was smaller than that, and uglier, the specific defeat of a man who had been running on forward momentum for years and had just run out of road. He gave them an address. It was a self-storage facility 8 miles north of the hospital, which explained the direction the vehicles had pulled when they'd repositioned. The unit number was a 4-digit code. The access key was on a key ring in his jacket pocket. Vasquez was already on the radio. Roark was already on the phone. Lydia stepped back from the table and looked at the window at the end of the corridor. The storm was still moving, but the worst of it had passed. The rain now steadier and quieter, kind that settled in for the long term, rather than the violent kind that spent itself all at once. Parking lot lights were visible again, through the wet glass, blurred but present. In the conference room behind her, Nolan was being led toward the corridor. His operative was being supported by Vasquez's man, his dislocated shoulder in a makeshift sling. Doyle was speaking in the careful language of someone ensuring everything was being recorded. Her phone buzzed. It was Paulina. ER is locked down. All patients stable. Septic transfer ready for 6 a.m. You okay? She typed back. Yes. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Stood in the corridor for a moment, hand still on her phone, the quiet, after the noise of it settling around her like something physical. The adrenaline was metabolizing. She could feel it the way she always had. The particular transition from operational clarity back into the weight of ordinary sensation, exhaustion, and the dull awareness of her own heartbeat and the faint ache in her knees from too long on hard floors. Ranger appeared at her side. She looked down at him. He looked up at her with the steady, undemanding attention that she'd spent 5 years trying not to miss. Come on, she said. They walked back toward the stairwell together. And she was already thinking about the storage facility, about whether Vasquez's team could secure it before the vehicles arrived, about the timeline, about whether 8 miles at this time of night with those road conditions was enough margin. And then her phone buzzed again, not Paulina this time, an unknown number. And when she looked at the screen, it was a text message from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. We have the package. She stopped walking. Her blood went cold. They hadn't waited for Nolan's contingency to activate. The vehicles had moved north on Meridian the moment Nolan had been taken into custody, which meant they'd been monitoring the situation in real time, which meant there was a surveillance asset somewhere in or near the building that Roark's sweep hadn't located, and they had known before Vasquez's radio call, before the address was given, before any of it, they had already moved. She looked at the text again. A second message arrived from the same number, 10 seconds later. Come alone, or everything burns. She read the text twice. Not because she didn't understand it the first time. Because she needed the 2 seconds to make a decision that had about 14 variables and no good options. And reading the same 4 words twice was the closest thing to thinking time she was going to get. We have the package. Come alone, or everything burns. The surveillance asset was somewhere in or near the building. That was the first variable. They'd monitored Nolan's arrest in real time, which meant audio at minimum, possibly visual. Conference room on the 2nd floor had 2 windows, both facing the parking lot. A directional microphone from one of the vehicles on Meridian could have covered it without anyone inside knowing. She'd been in that room for 20 minutes. They'd heard everything Nolan said, including the address. They'd moved before Vasquez could. She looked at the text again. The number was a burner, no carrier ID she recognized, the format clean and untraceable. Whoever had sent it knew she had her phone, knew she was standing somewhere in this building, and knew the message would reach her before she reached anyone else. Come alone. She put the phone in her pocket and walked back toward the conference room. Vasquez was still on the radio when she came through the door. Roark was on her phone. Doyle was coordinating with someone in a voice low enough that she caught only fragments. Nolan was seated against the far wall with his wrists still cuffed, and the second operative was on the floor beside him. And none of this had changed in the 4 minutes she'd been in the corridor. She crossed to Vasquez and waited for him to finish his radio call, which took 12 seconds. The storage facility, she said when he lowered it. I have 2 people moving now. 6 minutes out. They're already there. He looked at her. She showed him the phone. He read the messages, and his expression did something controlled and careful that she recognized as the face of a person recalibrating. He read them a second time, then looked at her. You're not going alone. I know. Then I need you to listen to me for 60 seconds without interrupting, she said, not aggressively. Directly with the specific economy of someone who'd identified the critical path and needed to walk it without detours. They're watching the building. They were monitoring the conference room, probably a directional asset from the parking lot. They have the package, which means they have leverage. And they've told me to come alone, which means they think they can use me as a trade. For Nolan. For Nolan, or for the package itself, or for time to get clear before your people arrive at the facility. I don't know which. But what I do know is that they've already demonstrated they can monitor our communications from outside, which means every radio call your people are making right now is telling them where to expect interference. Vasquez was quiet. It was the quality of quiet that meant he was listening, not conceding. I'm not going to contact them, she said. I'm not going to go alone. But your two people moving toward that facility right now need to go dark. No radio, no cell. Because whoever sent that text has been listening, and they know exactly what 6 minutes out looks like. He made the radio call immediately. 2 words, go dark. Then he looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking there's a surveillance asset within 300 meters of this building, which means one of the vehicles on Meridian didn't go north. One of them pulled out and one of them repositioned. She looked at Rourke, who had moved closer and was listening without pretending she wasn't. Can you pull the external camera feed? The parking structure across the street, it has commercial cameras on the 2nd level. Can try, Rourke said. She was already moving toward the room's landline. Lydia turned to Nolan. He'd been watching her from the wall with the contained expression of a man reevaluating something. Not panicking, he wasn't the kind of man who panicked, which made him more dangerous, not less. He'd given up the address because he'd calculated the odds and made a decision, but the calculation was ongoing, and she could see it in the steadiness of his focus. How many people did you bring? She said. I've answered enough questions. You gave us the address. That's already on record. The U.S. attorney conversation you wanted is contingent on cooperation. That's how it works. And you know how it works. If your people destroy that package, the cooperation calculus changes significantly. Nolan looked at her for a moment. 6, he said. 3 in the building, 2 vehicles, 1 external asset. The external asset is the surveillance unit. Yes. Where? The parking structure across the street. Level 2, northeast corner. It's a panel van. She looked at Rourke. Rourke was already talking into the phone. She looked at Vasquez. Can you get to the panel van without going through the main exit? There's a service tunnel from the basement loading area. I don't know where it comes out. I do. She'd mapped it in her 3rd week, not because she'd expected to need it, but because mapping was automatic, habitual. The thing her brain did in new environments without requiring instructions. It exits on the south side of the parking structure's ground level. You come up the north stairwell. You're 30 feet from the northeast corner of level 2. And if they see me coming, they're watching the hospital exits. Tunnel isn't an exit. It's a maintenance access, it'll read, as nothing to anyone who doesn't know it's there. Vasquez looked at her for the length of a breath. Then he said, I need a floor plan. I'll walk you to the tunnel entrance. The rest you can do from memory. She turned toward the door, then stopped. She turned back to Nolan. The 2 people at the storage facility. Are they under instructions to destroy the package before they're taken, or only if they see no other option? Nolan's jaw shifted. Only if they assess no other option. What constitutes no other option in their assessment? If federal agents move on the facility with a tactical approach, but not if it's quiet. The instructions have a threshold. It's not a hair trigger. She filed that and went through the door. The basement tunnel was exactly where she'd mapped it, a maintenance corridor running from the hospital's lower loading area under Harlow Street and up through a utility conduit into the parking structure's foundation level. It smelled of concrete and old water and the specific industrial staleness of spaces that existed for systems rather than people. The lights were motion activated and came on in sequential segments as they moved, which was going to be a problem if the panel van had any kind of monitoring on the tunnel exits. But there was nothing to be done about that. She walked Vasquez to the access point and showed him the stairwell door at the far end, the distance, the layout, as she'd memorized it. He had 2 things with him, that she didn't have a sidearm and a set of flex cuffs, and he moved with the efficiency of a man who didn't require encouragement. Give me 8 minutes, he said. You have 6 before your people reach the storage facility. Told them to go dark. Going dark doesn't stop them from arriving. He acknowledged that with a single nod and went through the tunnel. She went back upstairs. The next 6 minutes were the kind that expanded. She returned to the ER and moved through it, methodically checking in with Paulina, assessing the patients who'd been moved, stopping at Bay 4 to look at the telemetry readout on her septic patient and confirm what she'd already told Paulina to watch for. She did all of this with her hands steady and her face doing what it was supposed to do, because the patients didn't know what was happening in the corridors and the parking structure and the storage facility 8 miles north, and they didn't need to. They needed their nurse present and functional, and that was what she gave them. The 6-minute mark, her phone buzzed again. Not a text. Call. The same burner number, she answered it. You didn't come alone. The voice was male, mid-40s she estimated, the clipped inflection of someone with military background. Not warm. Not particularly threatening, just flat, professional. The tone of someone who had moved past the stage of persuasion. I haven't come at all, she said. I'm in the ER. The wrong answer. I don't make decisions that get my patients killed. If you wanted a different response, you should have thought about the setting. She kept her voice even. You have something I want. I have information you might want. What does that conversation look like? A pause. Nolan is in federal custody. Yes. The operation at the hospital failed. Yes. So you understand what we're working with. I understand you're holding a package that contains evidence in an active federal homicide investigation, and that, destroying it, makes you an accessory after the fact to 4 murders. That's the working picture from my end. She waited. From your end, I'm guessing the picture looks like a thinning set of options. Another pause. Longer. She heard wind in the background. He was outside, or in a vehicle with a window cracked. Somewhere within range of the building, because the burner signal had come through strong. What information, he said. Nolan gave us the facility address. He also told us the destruction protocol has a threshold. It's not automatic. You're waiting for an assessment trigger. She paused. Which means right now, your people at the facility are watching for a tactical approach. They're watching the road, the entrance, the perimeter. They're not watching the drainage easement on the south side of the property, because that's a blind angle from the main structure, and nobody thinks of drainage easements. She was making an inference. She didn't actually know the facility's layout, but she knew how people set up surveillance positions, what they watched, what they defaulted to ignoring, and she was making a bet that the voice on the phone would hear certainty in her tone and react to it. The silence on the other end was its own answer. Here's what's happening in the next 10 minutes, she said. Federal agents are at your facility. They're moving quietly, because I advised the approach. Package is going to be recovered intact. Your people there have 2 options: surrender and become witnesses with potential for cooperation agreements, or resist and face federal charges that will follow them for the rest of their careers. She let that land. What you decide in the next 60 seconds determines which category you're in. Call ended. She stood at the nursing station with the phone in her hand and waited. 40 seconds later, Rourke's phone rang. Lydia was close enough to hear one side of it, short sentences. Rourke's responses clipped and affirmative. Then Rourke looked up from the call and across the ER to where Lydia was standing. She gave a single nod. The package was secure. What happened in the following hours happened in layers. The way institutional responses always did, not in one clean moment, but in accumulating stages, each one requiring its own documentation and authorization and chain of communication. Vasquez reached the panel van on the 2nd level of the parking structure at the 7-minute mark. The surveillance operative inside was a former military signal specialist named Hartwell, who had been running audio monitoring on the hospital's exterior for 6 hours and had not, it turned out, anticipated the maintenance tunnel, and who surrendered without incident when Vasquez came through the stairwell door. The van contained directional audio equipment, a laptop with encrypted comms, and a secondary hard drive that Rourke's technical agent would spend the next 14 hours working through. At the storage facility, Vasquez's 2 operators arrived via the drainage easement. Lydia had mentioned she'd invented the specific detail about the blind angle. But drainage easements were standard blind angles, and the guess had been sound, and found 2 of Nolan's operatives in a state of indecision that tipped towards surrender when the federal identification came out. The package was a waterproof hard case, the kind used for sensitive equipment, locked with a 3-digit combination that the operatives provided after a 10-minute conversation with Rourke on the phone. Inside the case was a compact solid-state drive, a secondary printed manifest in a sealed plastic sleeve, and a single handwritten page in a cipher that Rourke's team recognized as a variant of a code system that had been used in joint task force operations a decade earlier. One she would later confirm was the notation style of the asset Lydia's team had been extracting during Cold Spire, written in the asset's own hand before the operation collapsed. The drive contained everything. Rourke called Lydia at 5:47 in the morning, as the storm was finally pulling east and the first gray light was beginning to reach the parking lot windows of Harlow General. The call lasted 3 minutes. Rourke spoke carefully, in the precise language of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know that what she was saying needed to be heard accurately. Lydia listened. She was sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Ranger was on the floor at her feet. The drive contains complete documentation of 11 unauthorized operations running from 2012 to 2019, Rourke said. Financial records indicating diversion of classified operation funds to private accounts, Nolan's and one other individual. Communications indicating foreknowledge of the Cold Spire ambush, including a directive authorizing the use of false LZ coordinates. She paused. And casualty reports. The original casualty reports, before they were falsified. The real cause of death documentation. Lydia looked at the wall. The real documentation, she said. Yes, meaning the falsified versions can be directly compared. Yes, it's a comprehensive evidentiary package. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been briefed. They're filing this morning. Another pause. Lieutenant Harmon, don't, she said, not unkindly. I'm going to say it anyway. Rourke's voice was steady. I've been working this case for 2 years. I've been working with incomplete evidence and sealed records and dead ends for 2 years. And I want you to understand that what your team recovered during that extraction in 2019, what they found and what they gave their lives to bring out, is the reason this case exists at all. The assets documentation is the foundation of everything we built on top of it. She stopped. They didn't die for nothing. I wanted you to hear me say that. The break room was very quiet. Lydia held the phone against her ear and looked at the wall and let the words go through her without immediately building a wall around them, which was harder than anything she'd done in the last 8 hours. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady, mostly. She ended the call and sat with the cold coffee for a while. Nolan was processed through federal custody by 6 a.m. and transferred to a federal detention facility by noon. His attorney at 8 a.m. and the first conversation with the U.S. Attorney's Office happened at 10, which Rourke described to Lydia in a brief text as exactly cooperative as you'd expect a man with this much evidence against him to be. The second senior officer implicated in the Iron Spire documentation, a brigadier general named Steele, currently commanding a joint operations center in Virginia, was detained at his office at 9:15 that morning by federal agents who had been briefed and moving before dawn. He had not been cooperative. That was the version Lydia heard secondhand. From Rourke, from Vasquez, from fragments of conversations she wasn't part of, but was close enough to catch. Spent most of those hours on the floor of Harlow General's ER, doing her shift work, because the septic patient in Bay 4 needed her ICU transfer managed, and Paulina was running on fumes, and Howell had retreated into the particular stunned formality of a man trying to process an extraordinary night by treating the ordinary parts of it as normal. He found her at the medication station at 7:30. The coagulation call, he said. She looked at him. Last night. You were right. He said it the way men like Howell said things they'd rehearsed, careful with the words, uncomfortable with the territory. I should have run the panel when you said. Drake made it through surgery, she said. What matters? I know. I'm saying he stopped, restarted. I've worked with a lot of nurses. The way you move through a department, the way you read patients. I don't know what your background is, and I'm not asking. But I've been dismissive, and that's not consistent with how I want to run this unit. She looked at him for a moment. He was uncomfortable, visibly. The discomfort of a man who'd spent a long time being comfortable with his own authority, and had recently had that comfort disturbed in a way he was still integrating. He wasn't terrible. He was a decent physician who'd developed habits of assumption over years of being the senior person in every room, and those habits weren't harmless, but they were, at least, apparently subject to revision. Okay, she said. He blinked. He'd expected more. That's it? You caught the error, and you're correcting it. That's the job. She turned back to the medication station. I need to get this transfer paperwork done before the ICU opens. Stood there for another second, then left. At 9 a.m., Admiral Doyle came to find her. He came without staff and without the formal posture of the night before, which told her something about what this conversation was supposed to be versus the official ones that would come later. He was 60 years old and looked it tired from the night, tired from years of work that accumulated in the way, work accumulated in that institution, but present and direct, and she respected the directness. He asked if they could sit somewhere quiet. She took him to the break room. She made fresh coffee this time. The official process is going to begin in the next several days, he said. Review of your service record, the Cold Spire documentation, the personnel files that were falsified. There will be a board, and the board will make recommendations. He held the coffee mug. I want to be honest with you about what I can and can't guarantee at this stage. I'd rather have honesty than guarantees, she said. Your rank, your record, your team's records. He said each one with the weight of someone who understood what the words held. Falsification is documented. The process for correction is established. I don't anticipate obstacles. He looked at her. Your team's families. They were given a cause of death that was a lie. Correcting that record means those families will have to be contacted and told what actually happened and why and what's been done about it. Thought about this. She'd thought about it in the break room at 5:47 a.m. while Rourke was talking, and before that in the supply room in the dark while 3 armed people moved through her corridor, and before that in the 5 years of being Lydia Marsh and thinking about Fallon's daughter who was 5 years old and believed her father had died in a training accident. They deserve the truth, she said. Yes, it's not going to be easy for them. It'll be harder than what they have now, and it'll also be the truth. She looked at her coffee. They've been living with a lie for 5 years. That's not they deserve better than that. Whatever the truth costs them, it's theirs to have. Doyle was quiet for a moment. Lieutenant Harmon. Marsh, she said. He paused. Both, perhaps. He set down his mug. There will also be the question of your own status. Whether you wish to return to active service, whether you wish to be formally separated with full recognition, whether... I don't need to answer that today. No, you don't. Good. She stood up, because she could use the ICU coordinator in the corridor, and the transfer paperwork was still not done. I'll be available for whatever the board needs, whatever the process needs. I'll cooperate fully. She looked at him. But right now I have a patient to transfer. He almost smiled. Of course. She went back to the floor. By mid-morning, the news had moved through the hospital in the way news moved through enclosed institutions, not as a single announcement, but as a current, shifting and branching, picking up detail and distortion as it went. Staff knew there had been an incident. They knew federal agents had been in the building. They knew that 3 patients had been treated for injuries unrelated to any condition they'd presented with at triage. They knew that Nurse Marsh had been involved in a capacity that nobody could clearly articulate, because the people who knew the accurate version were being careful about what they said, and to whom. Paulina found her at 10 a.m. in the corridor outside Bay 3. There are people saying things, she said. What kind of things? About you. About last night. Paulina was watching her with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same person. Someone said you were military. Someone is right. Paulina was quiet for a moment. The dog. He knew you. He did. And the men. They were there for you. Some of them. Yes. Paulina looked at her for a long moment. She was 26, 3 years out of nursing school, earnest in the way that the job hadn't worn down yet, and she had good instincts and a genuine steadiness that Lydia had been quietly glad of every shift they'd worked together. Are you okay? She asked. It was the first time anyone had asked her that since the night before. She considered it honestly, because Paulina deserved honesty. I don't know yet, she said. I will be. Paulina nodded. She seemed to accept that as the real answer it was. At 11 a.m., Rourke called again. We've matched the audio from Hartwell's surveillance rig to the conference room conversation, she said. Full recording of Nolan's confession, including the acknowledgement of the false LZ coordinates and the phrase authorize the use, which the U.S. Attorney's team is very interested in. She paused. There's something else. Lydia waited. The second hard drive from the panel van. Hartwell's laptop. Rourke's voice shifted slightly. He'd been running the surveillance on the hospital for 6 hours, but the access logs on the laptop go back 14 months. He's been running surveillance on you for over a year, Lydia. Patient tracking, schedule documentation, employment verification, photos. The cold thing in her chest. Nolan's been watching you, she said. Since before Ranger's tracker flagged me. The tracker flagged you 8 weeks ago. The laptop activity starts 14 months ago. Another pause. Which means someone else found you first. Someone flagged your location to Nolan before the tracker system was accessed. She stood in the corridor of Harlow General, in the morning light that had finally come through the storm, with the ordinary sounds of the hospital around her, and the weight of what Rourke was saying settling into place. There was someone inside, she said. We think so. Someone with access to identity records the kind of access that would allow them to run a search on reconstructed identities, cross-reference with physical descriptors and behavioral markers. Rourke's voice was careful. Someone who wasn't Nolan, someone who was running their own search and feeding the results to him. And you don't know who. Not yet. The laptop has encrypted comms we're still breaking down. But the search methodology, it's sophisticated. It's someone who knows how constructed identities work. Someone who knows what to look for. Lydia turned this over. 14 months. The laptop had been running for 14 months. She'd been careful for 5 years, and someone had found her 14 months ago, and she hadn't known, had worked her shifts, and walked her route, and tended her patients without knowing that somewhere a screen was tracking her. Could be Steele, she said. It could be. Or it could be someone we haven't identified yet. Rourke let that sit. I wanted you to know before the afternoon briefing, because at the briefing this is going to come up, and I didn't want it to be a surprise. Thank you. She ended the call and stood for a moment. Someone had found her, and she hadn't known. Someone may still be out there, beyond Nolan, beyond Steele, with knowledge of who she was and access to information about the case. Here, the evidence was filed. Nolan was in custody, but the thread that Rourke had just handed her was loose and unresolved, and she felt the specific discomfort of unfinished threat assessments, the same discomfort she'd learned to manage in environments where not knowing was the default condition, and you operated anyway. Ranger was at her side. She reached down and put her hand on his head, the automatic gesture, not thought out, just present, and he leaned into it the same way he always had. She looked up. Down the corridor, the elevator opened, and a man she'd never seen before stepped out, wearing a naval officer's uniform, and he walked toward the nursing station with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. She had never seen him before, but the moment his eyes landed on her, he stopped, and she knew, with the specific certainty of a person who had survived Cold Spire by learning to read the moment before the thing happened, that he had been expecting to see her exactly here, at exactly this hour. The man was not Steele. He was younger than Steele, younger than Nolan, and his uniform was clean, and his rank insignia was current, and there was nothing at all wrong with his appearance, except that Doyle's office had not mentioned any additional personnel coming to the hospital this morning, and Rourke's briefing had not included his name, and the way he'd stopped when he saw her was not the stop of a man surprised by an unexpected presence. It was the stop of a man making a decision. His hand moved toward his jacket. His hand stopped before it reached the jacket, not because he'd changed his mind, because Ranger had moved. The dog went from standing to full alert in the space between 1 second and the next weight forward, body low. A sound in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, but was the thing before a growl, the registered warning of an animal that had made an assessment and was communicating the result. He was between Lydia and the man in the corridor before she'd consciously processed her own threat reading, and she trusted that, the way she'd always trusted it, the way she'd trained him to be trustworthy precisely in these moments. The man in the naval uniform looked at the dog, then at her. His hand came out of his jacket, slowly, empty, and he held it away from his body in the careful posture of someone who had just recalculated the situation and decided visible compliance was the smarter short-term move. I'm not here to hurt anyone, he said. His voice was even, practiced. The voice of someone who'd learned how to sound reasonable in unreasonable circumstances. That hand was moving toward your jacket, she said. It was reaching for my identification. Then reach for it the same way, slowly. 2 fingers. He did. The ID wallet came out from the interior pocket and he extended it toward her naval officer's credentials, the photo matching his face, the name reading Commander Philip Ardell. She looked at it without taking it. She'd learned not to take things people handed her in situations like this. Taking created a moment of focus shift, and focus shift was what people counted on. Commander Ardell, she said. Admiral Doyle's office didn't mention you were coming. I'm not here through Doyle's office. Then whose? He glanced at the nursing station, where two nurses were watching them, with the frozen attention of people who'd registered something wrong but hadn't identified what. He looked back at her. Somewhere private would be better. I had a conversation in a private room last night that turned into a very unpleasant situation. Prefer the corridor. He absorbed that without reaction. I'm not part of Nolan's network. You'll understand if that requires verification. That's reasonable. He said it without impatience, which told her something he'd expected resistance, had prepared for it, which meant this was a conversation he'd been building toward for some time. I've been running an internal investigation within the Judge Advocate General's office for the past 18 months. Not under Doyle, not under anyone connected to the Iron Spire chain. We became aware of the NCIS case 14 months ago when we identified anomalous access to personnel records connected to Operation Cold Spire. She held very still. The anomalous access, she said. That was you. We were tracking whoever was looking for you, not looking for you ourselves. When the search pattern appeared, the cross-referencing of reconstructed identities against behavioral markers, we flagged it because it matched a surveillance methodology we'd seen before in connection with Nolan's network. We traced it to Hartwell's encrypted comm system. He paused. We've known about Hartwell for 11 months, and you didn't move on him. Moving on him would have told Nolan we were watching. We needed the full network identified before we acted. He looked at her steadily. We also needed to find you, not to expose you, to protect you. Because once Nolan knew you were alive, and we assessed it was a matter of when, not if you were going to need the JAG investigation running parallel to NCIS. You were going to need someone in the system who wasn't connected to anyone who might want the evidence buried. Corridor was quiet around them. A gurney moved past at the far end, pushed by an orderly who glanced at them and moved on. The hospital's morning rhythm was settling in. The shift change sounds, the soft announcements over the staff channel, the ordinary texture of a place going back to its regular work after an extraordinary night. She looked at Ardell for a long moment. She looked at the credentials again, pulled out her phone and called Rourke. Commander Philip, Ardell, JAG office, she said, when Rourke picked up, standing in my corridor. Tell me what you know about him in the next 30 seconds. Silence. Keyboard sounds. Then Ardell. Yes. We've been aware of the parallel JAG investigation. We made contact with his office 6 weeks ago. He's legitimate, Lydia. He's been working the same case from a different angle. A pause. I should have mentioned he might make contact. I didn't know it would be this morning. She ended the call. She looked at Ardell. You have about 20 minutes before this building fills up with more federal officials than the parking lot can hold, she said. Say what you came to say. What Ardell had came in 2 parts, and both parts mattered. The first part was the insider, the person who had found her 14 months ago and fed the information to Nolan's network. It wasn't Steele, who was operational and careful and had enough insulation between himself and the dirty work that he rarely touched the machinery directly. It was a JAG paralegal named Dora Finch, who had been placed in the records division 8 years earlier, and who had, for reasons Ardell's team was still fully unraveling, maintained a quiet information pipeline to Nolan's network through Hartwell for the past 3 years. Finch had been arrested at her home in Alexandria at 6 a.m. that morning, coordinated with Nolan's federal detention and Steele's arrest to prevent any warning traveling between them. Lydia listened to this without interrupting. What she felt about it was less satisfying than she might have expected, not relief, not closure, just the flat recognition of another variable resolved. Finch was in custody. The pipeline was cut. That was what mattered. The second part was what Ardell's investigation had built independently of NCIS. The 11 operations documented on the drive you recovered last night, he said, are substantiated by a parallel evidence set we've been building from internal JAG records, financial authorization anomalies, command override documentation, personnel assignment irregularities, what NCIS has from the assets documentation, and what we have from the institutional records together They constitute a case that has no meaningful gaps. He said it plainly, without triumph. Nolan's attorney is going to look at the combined evidentiary package this afternoon and advise full cooperation. My assessment. And Steele. Steele is less cooperative, but cooperation isn't required. The records are sufficient without it. She looked at him. People who were inside those 11 operations. Beyond Nolan and Steele, are there others? 2 additional individuals who we're currently in the process of. Are they still in positions of command? He paused. One has been suspended pending investigation as of this morning. The other is on administrative leave. Neither has command authority over anything operational as of 6 hours ago. She breathed. It wasn't over. It was never over cleanly. There would be legal proceedings and appeals, and the long institutional grind of accountability, moving through systems designed to move slowly, but the operational part of it, part where people with authority and weapons could make decisions that ended lives and buried the evidence. That part was over. Thank you, she said. Ardell nodded. He was not a man of unnecessary words, which she appreciated. He put his credentials away. The board review of your record will begin next week. The JG office will have a representative present. I can tell you, without overpromising, that the documentation is unambiguous. Falsification is complete and demonstrable. I know, she said. Your team's records are the same. Fallon, Okafor, Maddox, and Reyes. He named them, and she let each name land, fully, didn't deflect it. Their service records will be corrected, and their families will be formally notified through the Casualty Affairs Office. There will be a ceremony, posthumous recognition of their service under the real circumstances of their deaths. He paused. Process takes time. I want to be honest about that. Process taking time doesn't bother me, she said. I've waited 5 years. I can wait a little longer. She went back to work. The days that followed were the strangest of her recent life, which continued to be saying something. The ER at Harlow General ran its ordinary rhythms, traumas, and infections, and the seasonal presentations that came with the shift in weather, the flu cases beginning to build, the elderly patients who'd been managing chronic conditions alone and had finally reached a threshold. She worked her shifts. She updated her charts. She pushed Howell on 2 cases she thought he was under-treating, and was right both times. And after the second time, he stopped requiring pushing and started listening when she spoke, progress of a kind she hadn't expected and didn't take for granted. Paulina asked her once quietly, during a slow Wednesday morning, what she was going to do. About what? About all of it. Your rank. The military. Whether you're going to go back. Lydia thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. Is that a real I don't know or a polite one? She almost smiled. Real. I genuinely don't know. Paulina accepted that. For what it's worth, she said. You're a good nurse. Whatever else you are. She went to the board review in the second week. It was held in a federal building in downtown Tacoma, in a conference room that smelled of carpet cleaner and had an American flag in the corner and a long table with 7 people on one side. Ardell was there, and Roark, and a representative from the Casualty Affairs Office, and 2 officers she hadn't met whose role was administrative review. Admiral Doyle was there. He sat at the center of the table, and he looked tired in the way people looked after weeks of institutional upheaval, the kind of tired that didn't resolve with sleep. She sat across from them alone. She'd been offered a representative and had declined. She didn't need someone to speak for her. She'd been speaking for herself through worse situations than a review board, and the habit of letting other people carry words that were hers to carry was one she'd shed a long time ago. The review took 4 hours. They went through everything Cold Spire in its complete documented form. Her extraction from the field, the documentation of her new identity, the 5 years at Harlow General, the events of the storm night. They asked careful questions. She gave careful answers. When the questions were about things she'd done that weren't clean, and some of them weren't, because survival over 5 years required choices that didn't always hold up to peacetime scrutiny, she said so, plainly, without framing them as anything other than what they were. Doyle asked her, near the end of the 4 hours, what she wanted. My team's records corrected, she said. Their families told the truth. That's the first thing. And for yourself, she thought about it. Not what she was supposed to want, not what the situation seemed to call for, what she actually wanted, which was a question she'd stopped asking herself sometime around year 2 of being Lydia Marsh, because the asking of it had been too destabilizing. My name back, she said. My real name. Whatever form that takes legally, whatever process it requires, I want to be able to use my name again. She paused. The rest, I'm still working out. The families were notified the following week. She wasn't present for those conversations. Casualty Affairs Office handled them, with Ardell's JG representative and Roark's team available for questions. She'd been asked if she wanted to be involved, and had said no. Not initially. Those conversations belonged to those families first, without her presence complicating the emotional geography of them. Fallon's wife was named Mara. She called Lydia 3 weeks after the notification, on a Tuesday afternoon when Lydia was between shifts and sitting in her apartment with the deadbolt locked and Ranger on the floor beside the couch, his familiar weight anchoring the room. Call lasted 40 minutes. Mara cried for the first part of it and was quiet for the middle part and asked questions for the last part, careful questions about what her husband had been doing and what he'd found and whether he'd known, at the end, what it was worth. Lydia answered as completely and as honestly as she could, which meant there were things she said that were hard to say and things she chose to hold back because Mara had a 5-year-old daughter and some details served no one. He was that person in that unit, Lydia said, near the end. He would have been. There are people alive right now, in ways they'll never trace back to anything, because of decisions he made. That's not a consolation. I know that's not a consolation, but I want you to know it's true. Mara was quiet for a moment. His daughter is going to want to know who he was. When she's ready to ask, I'll tell her. You'd do that? Another silence. What do I tell her now? She's 5. She knows something changed. She knows something is different about what happened to her dad, but she doesn't have the words for it yet. Lydia thought about it. 5 years old. The age of beginning to understand that the world had shapes she hadn't been told about yet. Tell her that her father was someone who found the truth when it was hidden and held on to it when it was hard to hold. Tell her that's the kind of person worth knowing about. She paused. The rest can come later, when she can hold more of it. Mara said thank you, and then she said it again, and the second time it landed differently than the first. Lydia sat with the phone after the call ended, and Ranger put his chin on her knee, and she let him, and didn't try to immediately convert the feeling into something manageable. Nolan's plea agreement was filed 6 weeks after the storm night. His attorney had, as Ardell predicted, taken one look at the combined evidentiary package and advised comprehensive cooperation. The agreement covered the 11 operations, the Cold Spire intelligence falsification, the casualty report fraud, the 4 counts of murder in the first degree, and the conspiracy charges connecting him to Finch and Hartwell. He would serve a minimum of 35 years in federal prison at a facility he had not been consulted about. His pension was revoked. His security clearances were permanently canceled. His name was formally removed from the commendations and citations it had appeared on over a career that had begun, Lydia understood, with genuine service before it had been corroded by a different set of priorities. She read the filing in Roark's office on a Thursday afternoon with bad office coffee and Roark sitting across from her doing paperwork and not trying to make the moment into something it didn't need to be, which was exactly the right way to handle it. Steele accepted a plea 3 days after Nolan. His cooperation was less comprehensive, but his evidence was more self-contained. The JAG records were sufficient, and he received 22 years and the same revocations. 2 additional officers implicated through the broader Iron Spire documentation received sentences of 11 and 14 years respectively, which the federal prosecutors described as proportionate to their roles, and which Lydia read in the same Roark office on a Friday morning and accepted as the resolution. They were not perfect, not entirely satisfying in the way that justice in real institutions rarely was, but documented, public, and real. Finch was sentenced separately 8 months later to 7 years for conspiracy and obstruction. Hartwell cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced sentence and testified at Steele's trial in detail about the surveillance operation that had tracked Lydia for 14 months. The testimony was public record. Her name was in it, her real name. Lieutenant Elise Harmon, U.S. Navy, Field Extraction Specialist, Operation Cold Spire. Her name in federal court records, attached not to a casualty report, but to a testimony about a surveillance operation designed to locate and eliminate her before she could testify. The inversion of it, that the document proving her identity was a record of someone trying to erase her, was the kind of thing she turned over in her mind occasionally without reaching a conclusion, because some things didn't resolve into meaning cleanly, and that was honest. The ceremony was on a clear November morning, 8 months after the storm. It was held at a naval installation outside Seattle, in a space that wasn't large but was formal rows of chairs, the flags present and correct, family members in the seats that mattered most. Mara was there with her daughter, whose name was June, who was 5 3/4 and wore a dress she'd clearly chosen herself, and sat with the focused seriousness of a child who understood that something important was happening even without understanding all of what it was. Okafor's parents were there, from Atlanta. His mother, in a gray suit that she'd clearly considered carefully, and his father, who didn't speak to anyone, but held his wife's hand the entire time and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man receiving something he'd been owed for years and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. Maddox's brother came from Portland. Reyes's sister came from Houston. They were all people Lydia had never met, who had spent 5 years grieving on the basis of information that was false, and she sat in her seat and looked at each of them and carried the weight of that without putting it down. Doyle conducted the ceremony. He was formal and correct, and when he read the citations, the real citations, the accurate ones, the ones describing what the 4 members of the Cold Spire extraction team had actually found and actually done and actually died, for his voice was steady, but only just. The posthumous medals were presented to the families. June Fallon held her father's medal in both hands and looked at it for a long time with the focused attention of someone committing something to memory. Then Doyle called Lydia's name. Not Marsh, Harmon. She stood and walked to the front of the room, and she was not graceful about it. Her hands were not steady for the first time in longer than she could remember, and she was aware of that and didn't try to conceal it. Because the people in this room had earned the real version of her, and performing composure she didn't feel was a different kind of lie. Her record was formally corrected, and her rank restored in the official language that bureaucratic processes required. And Doyle shook her hand with both of his, in the way that meant more than the handshake itself. And she stood in front of the families of the people she had served with and who had not come home, and she looked at all of them and did not look away. She said a few words. She hadn't planned them formally. She'd thought about what she wanted to say for weeks and had decided against a script because the people in this room deserved something that wasn't composed. "I've been a nurse for 5 years," she said, "and I was a soldier before that, in ways I couldn't talk about. Those 2 things used to feel like different lives, like I'd closed a door on one of them to exist in the other." She paused. "I don't think that anymore. The same thing that made me good at the work I did before makes me good at the work I do now. Paying attention. Not looking away from what's hard. Staying in the room when leaving would be easier." She looked at June, who was looking back at her with serious, clear eyes. People we lost during Cold Spire were doing exactly that. They found something they weren't supposed to find, and they held on to it, and it cost them everything. Spent 5 years trying to figure out whether that was worth it. She stopped. It was. Not because the outcome was clean, it wasn't. Not because justice was fast, it wasn't. But because the truth they carried came home. It took time and it took damage, but it came home. And the people in this room deserve to know that what happened to their family was not wasted. She sat down. The room was quiet. Then Mara started clapping, and then Okafor's mother, and then everyone else, And it was not the choreographed applause of formal occasions, but the real kind, uneven and not quite simultaneous, people expressing something they'd been holding for a long time. June Fallon looked across the room at Lydia and held up her father's medal. Lydia nodded at her. She went back to the hospital on Monday. Not because she had to the paperwork, for her military reinstatement offered options, and one of those options was returning to active service with back pay and full recognition, and a career path that could have looked like many things. She'd considered it. She'd considered it seriously, in the way she tried to consider significant decisions, without dismissing it because it was complicated. She'd turned it down. Not because the military had failed her, it had, and it hadn't, and those two things were both true and not resolvable into a single clean verdict. Not because she was angry, though she had been, specific people and specific decisions, and that anger was appropriate, and she'd let herself have it. She'd turned it down because she'd looked honestly at what the last 5 years had built and realized it wasn't a cover story anymore. It was her. She was a nurse. She was a good one. She'd been shaped by training and experience that most of her colleagues didn't have, and that made her better at the work. And the work mattered in the specific way that work mattered when it was the difference between someone going home or not. She'd stood in emergency rooms at 2 in the morning and held the line on cases that no one else was paying enough attention to. And she'd done it as Lydia Marsh, and she could do it as Elise Harmon or as both, which was what she was. She could be both. She didn't have to choose which version of herself to bury. Howell was at the nursing station when she came in Monday morning. He handed her a chart without preamble. Day 2 has a pressure situation I'd like your read on. She took the chart. She read it in 30 seconds. Did you run a lactate? Not yet. Run it now. And get me the last 2 sets of vitals. I want to see the trend. He was already moving. Paulina appeared at her elbow with coffee, real coffee, from the good machine, not the break room sludge. Welcome back, she said. I wasn't gone that long. Long enough. Paulina looked at her with the careful attention of someone who'd been working alongside a person for 2 years and was still revising their understanding of who that person was. You good? Lydia took the coffee. She thought about the question with the same honesty she'd brought to Paulina's question in the break room months ago, and the same honesty she'd tried to bring to everything since that storm night, because dishonesty as a coping mechanism had run its course, and she wasn't interested in picking it back up. Getting there, she said. That was true. It was more true than it had been 8 months ago, and less true than it would be in another 8 months. And that was how it worked, not in the clean arc of a thing that resolved and settled, but in the ongoing, accumulating work of someone who had been through something real and was building something real on the other side of it. She went into Bay 2. She worked the case. She was right about the pressure situation, and the lactate confirmed it. And she and Howell course-corrected together, not easily. They still had the friction of 2 people learning each other's patterns, but functionally, which was enough. She moved through the rest of the shift with the specific focus of someone who was present for the work and not managing 2 realities simultaneously for the first time in 5 years. And the quality of that presence was something she noticed without making too much of it. At noon, Vasquez texted her. Ranger's reassignment paperwork came through. He's not going back to active duty. Age and service record, they're retiring him. She read it standing at the nursing station. What happens to him? She texted back. 3 seconds. Up to you. If you want him. She looked at the text for a moment. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and went back to her patient. That evening she drove to the naval facility, where Ranger had been kenneled since the storm night. The drive was 40 minutes, and the evening was clear, the kind of Pacific Northwest evening that came occasionally between weather systems, with low light and a horizon that went on longer than seemed reasonable. Ranger came out of the kennel building ahead of his handler, and he didn't look any different than he had in the ER corridor 8 months ago. Still the same scarred, steady, implacably focused animal. moving with the economy of something that had been trained and shaped by a particular kind of life, and wore that life in the way it occupied space. He walked directly to her. He sat down at her feet and looked up at her face. Crouched down to his level, which was something she'd done in the supply room at 2 a.m. in the middle of a lockdown, and in the conference room after Nolan was cuffed, and in the break room on the morning after the storm. And she put both hands on either side of his face, the way you did with an animal you knew, and he leaned into it. "Found me," she said. "You have no idea what you started." He didn't, obviously. He wasn't processing the preceding 8 months of federal proceedings and board reviews, and family notifications and plea agreements. He was a dog who had located someone he recognized and was registering her presence with the uncomplicated directness that she had sometimes in the longer stretches of the last 5 years. Envied. She stood up. She clipped the lead, the same tactical lead, olive green, the one she'd used to train him on, and they walked to the car together, and she drove home. There was no version of this story where everything was fixed. That was worth saying plainly, because stories that end with everything fixed were telling a comfortable lie, and she'd had enough of lies. Okafor and Fallon and Maddox and Reyes were still dead. Their families were still rebuilding around the specific shape of absences that couldn't be filled, just gradually accommodated. The institutional systems that had made Cold Spire possible, the gaps in oversight, the concentration of authority in people who'd learned to be unaccountable, hadn't been dismantled by 4 arrests and a series of plea agreements. They'd been interrupted. That was different. Nolan was in prison. Steele was in prison. 2 other men who had made themselves comfortable inside the machinery of power and had used that comfort to end lives were in prison. The legal proceedings had been public. The names had been reported. The casualty reports had been formally corrected and entered into the official record. That was real. That was something that had existed as a lie 5 years ago and existed as documented truth now. And the distance between those 2 states was the distance her team had traveled, and her, and the families, and Rourke, who'd spent 2 years building a case in the dark. She didn't take that for granted. She also didn't mistake it for the end of something. It was more accurate to call it a threshold, a point past which certain things were no longer possible, and certain other things became possible that hadn't been before. She was on the right side of it. 6 months after the ceremony, June Fallon's teacher sent home a school project. The assignment had been to write about someone you admired. June had written about her father, what the medal meant, what she understood of what he'd done, what her mother had told her. And at the end, in the careful handwriting of a 6-year-old, she had written, "My dad found the truth when it was hiding, and he didn't let go of it, even when it was hard. My mom says that's the bravest thing a person can do." Mara sent Lydia a photo of it. She looked at it for a long time on a Tuesday morning, sitting in her apartment before her shift, with Ranger on the floor at her feet and the low winter light coming through the window in the unhurried way it did in the Pacific Northwest in January. She saved the photo. She put the phone down. She looked at Ranger. "Come on," she said. She got her bag. She locked the deadbolt habit. Still, though the reasons behind it had shifted from hiding to simply caring about security, which was a different thing. She walked the route to the hospital, the same route she'd walked for years, the one that had been tracked and mapped by people trying to find her, the one that had brought Ranger's tracker into range of her life and started the chain of events that had unraveled 5 years of careful hiding in a single storm-battered night. She walked it without looking over her shoulder. That was new. That was recent. That was still sometimes effortful. The absence of the constant perimeter check, the learning not to scan every face for threat, the slow renovation of a vigilance that had been essential and was now, at least partially, allowed to rest. She wasn't naive about what the world was. She'd seen enough of it to know that systems failed, and people in authority abused it, and institutions were capable of burying inconvenient truths for years. She knew that the machinery of accountability was slow and imperfect and often required someone willing to hold a truth that nobody wanted held for longer than anyone to hold it alone. She'd held it, Her team had held it first, in the 4 minutes of Coldspire when it had cost them everything, and she'd carried it forward from there for 5 years, in the body of a woman named Lydia Marsh, who was quieter than she'd been, and more careful, and occasionally looked at her own hands and thought about what they'd been trained to do and what they were doing now, and whether those two things were as different as they seemed. They weren't. The hands that had applied tourniquets in a corridor at 3 a.m., and the hands that had recalibrated medication dosages at 7 p.m., and the hands that had rebuilt a stranger's dislocated shoulder while the building was in lockdown, those were the same hands, shaped by the same commitment to staying in the room, staying with the patient, not looking away from the hard thing when the hard thing was what the situation required. She was both things. She had always been both things. She went into the hospital and checked in at the nursing station and took the chart Paulina handed her and looked at the patient and thought about what the patient needed, specifically and carefully and without distraction, the way she'd been taught and the way she'd taught herself and the way she would continue to do tomorrow and the day after that. Behind her, at the entrance, Ranger sat in the spot she'd arranged with hospital administration, a formal working animal accommodation. The paperwork, surprisingly easy, once Doyle's office, had weighed in and watched the room with his steady, unhurried attention. She'd been buried for 5 years. She'd come back in a storm, one midnight, when a dog who remembered her had walked across an emergency room and sat down at her feet and refused to pretend she was someone she wasn't. Truth had been waiting the whole time. It always is.